We are thrilled to welcome Alec Lobrano to our What's Cooking series. So first, a little background on Alec. He grew up in Westport, Connecticut, and lived in Boston, New York, and London before moving to Paris, his home today. He moved there in 1986. He was European Correspondent for Gourmet magazine from 1999 until it closed in 2009. And he's written about food and travel for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Travel Leisure, Conde Nast Traveler, and the list goes on. He's the author of two previous books, Hungry for Paris, The Ultimate Guide to the City's 110 Best Restaurants, and Hungry for France. But we're here to discuss Alec's new book, My Place at the Table, A Recipe for a Delicious Life in Paris. The book has been published to rave reviews. Kirkus, which is a professional review magazine who we call Cranky Kirkus, said this about Alec. Lobrano writes with mouth-watering elan, dash, and feeling. Publishers Weekly gave it a starred review and said Lobrano's story is inspiring and his prose inviting. Readers will savor every last page. I personally love the book and wanted to book a ticket to Paris as soon as I finished it. Not only is this book beautifully written and transporting, but Alec also includes a section at the end called The 30 Best Restaurants, my little black book featuring his 30 best favorite restaurants in Paris. So without further ado, welcome Alec, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, my pleasure.
So what do you want to tell us about, why don't you give us a little background of how you ended up in Paris? And
Sure. When I finished college in Massachusetts and moved to New York City, I worked in book publishing for a long time, which was wonderful because my favorite things are eating, traveling, reading, and writing. So book publishing was natural for me. The only problem was that it paid so poorly that I used to sometimes walk home from work because I didn't have the money to buy a subway token. So I'd line in my fold-outs, sofa bed, my little studio in Greenwich Village, and follow the molding around the room in the streetlight, thinking, how can I get back to Europe? I had done a junior year abroad in London. I'd stayed for 14 months in the UK. I loved it. I loved London, but I also loved, I was studying Victorian art and architecture, and traveled often to Europe. I went to Amsterdam and Germany and all over the place. So my goal was, I thought, I don't want to, every time I'm going to travel in Europe, I want to be in Europe and be able to travel easily in Europe until I can really slack my curiosity. And as I wrote in an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, what happened was my first trip to Europe, my mother was a brilliant woman an art historian and social activist and all kinds of things, who, when she inherited some money from an unknown great aunt, looked at us and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to Europe this summer. We're going to spend it. You're not supposed to do this, but we are. So we spent 2 months in Europe with Mom as the best guide in the whole world. But instead of falling in love with Caravaggio, I fell in love with carbonara. I mean, I became absolutely obsessed by the food, and the grand finale of that trip was Paris, where I just could not believe what I mean, it's the most elegant, beautiful city in the world. I couldn't believe you go into a shop and, to buy a pastry and people would tie it up inside of a little pyramid with a ribbon to carry it from your finger. I was absolutely besotted. So I was wanting desperately to come back and spend time in Europe. And my flying carpet, bizarrely enough, happened when I heard of a job working as a fashion reporter in the office of Fairchild Publications, a big American fashion publisher, and applied for it and quite improbably landed the job. And so I skipped across the English Channel. I was living in London then, skipped across the English Channel. And then, my new life in Paris began in September 1986.
please share what was it John Fairchild said to you?
Yes, when I went to see him when the Fairchild offices were still on East 12th Street in New York City, and we had a cordial conversation, and then I said to him finally that I was getting very anxious, and I said to Mr. Fairchild, he said, well, you seem like the perfect person, and I said, well, thank you so much, but I do have, there's something I just have to tell you. I said I know absolutely nothing about fashion, and I don't want to, if in all fairness to you and to myself. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about that, Alec. I could tell that when you walked in here." Um, which was, an arrow in the chest. And he said, and furthermore, no, don't worry about it at all, because if it doesn't work out, that's easy. I'll fire you. So I thought, oh, okay.
I love that. Um, I like this question. How does the Paris dining scene compare to that of London, New York, Sydney, Los Angeles, and other major English-speaking cities
Today.
today?
Yeah. Paris, as Paris has just recently opened up again, much to our delight. Because I love to cook. Unlike many food writers, I am an avid cook, but I've never cooked. I've cooked my fingers down to the bone after a year of, lockdowns. We had 2 lockdowns in France. I mean, the first one was 4 months in Paris, and then after that ended, we got in the car and drove south, where we have a little stone house in a village down there, and did nothing but cook. So I realized how much I missed restaurants during this challenging time, sad, difficult, frightening, challenging time for all of us, and all of our lives being disrupted. I realized what restaurants really meant to me. I realized that it wasn't just the food. It is the fact that going to a restaurant is like going to the theater. I missed the sound of other people's voices. I missed overhearing conversations. I missed laughter. I missed, all the little dramas that are going on around you in a public setting. And every restaurant is like a little keyhole that you peer through to gain a better understanding of where you actually are, both the city, the town, the city, the country, whatever. So I desperately, desperately miss restaurants. Going back to restaurants again, happily. There's a lot of energy in Paris right now. I mean, I was worried that the jolt to the restaurants, most French restaurants, their margins, their financial margins are transparent. And I feared that many of them would not make it, even with government aid. But there's a tenacity and a passion among many Parisian and French chefs that meant that they got through the rapids and they're thriving. And what's fascinating in Paris right now, there are a couple things going on. The city's never been more diverse in terms of its talent pool. There are people coming to cook in Paris from all over the world, from Mexico, Australia, hundreds of people from Japan, the Japanese. There's a great love affair between France and Japan because they recognize themselves in each other in terms of a love of aesthetics and whatever. But the diversity of the culinary talent pool in Paris is astonishing. Which is also leading to a greater international offer in Paris than has ever existed before. I mean, we're not London or New York or LA or Miami, but we have a better and more interesting international offer in Paris than we've ever had before. And there's a new generation of incredibly talented young chefs who are, champing at the bit and opening restaurants in spite of all the unknowns. So the restaurant scene is thriving. It's also completely being reconfigured. The old pyramidal shape, which we've all known for years, which was established and supported by the scaffolding of the Michelin Guide, 3 stars up here, and then going down and down and down to the broad base, has pretty much flattened out. I mean, there's a great, great thing going on right now. Do we need, in the age of the internet, do we need Michelin anymore? Is Michelin a beneficial or detrimental to the evolution of French cooking in 2021? If you wondered what I think both.
I was going to ask that.
Okay. I think both. I think that it upholds a certain degree of standards, but I also think that it's very hidebound. The great shocks that have occurred have not been, as I fear, the closing of hundreds of wonderful little neighborhood restaurants. It's that recently a lot of very fancy and prestigious restaurants in Paris have either closed, including Alain Ducasse's 3-star restaurant at the Hotel Place Athénée, which was voluntarily closed by the hotel. and L'Abbaye, which was a two-star restaurant at the Hotel Shangri-La. The famous Grand Véfour in the Palais Royal has gone to a new format. It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner now, and you can get a good meal there for about $50, which is cheap as opposed to the $450 that it would have cost you before. What's happening now is that in Paris, and it's happening really, really quickly, is that people will always want to eat really good food, but they also are going out to have a good time, and they want to be in settings that are relaxed and friendly as opposed to, straight-laced and formal. So there's a lot happening over here right now, and it's really exciting.
And like to continue on that, what's the effect then of like food bloggers and that type of thing on the restaurant scene?
Well, it's interesting. Among colleagues, we talk about this all the time, because one of the things that I find most difficult to explain to people, I'm very sympathetic to it. I think the internet is brilliant, and I travel a great deal. When I was in Greece recently, I do what anyone else does. I read high, low, and everywhere to find out, where should I eat, and then having sort of sampled a variety of opinions, I decide what looks interesting and reliable and pull back from that. I think crowdsourced restaurant review sites like Zagat, for which I once worked, I was the founding editor of the Paris Zagat Guide, was a brilliant invention, but there's a difference between being subjective, which is an opinion, and objective, which is what a critic does. I mean, whether it's a theater critic or a food critic, there's a level of expertise that person brings to the evaluation that is acquired over the course of long, professional experience, deep learning, trial and error, and just a daily seriousness. I mean, I think of some of the really great food writers in the US right now, like Tom Sietsma, food critic for the Washington Post. And you read his reviews and they're utterly charming and they're easy to read, but he's giving you a huge amount of information, and all the way through the review, he's explaining to you why he's coming to the judgments that he's coming to. It's a very, very elegant and delicate and beautiful thing to do, because he respects your right to have an opinion, but he's offering his own because he thinks that you might actually like to have the judgment of an expert. And for me, I simplify it sometimes, Claudia, by saying, if I suddenly didn't feel very well, I could do what we all do, which is to go to Google now and try and figure it out myself. And if it goes away in 24 hours, so much the better. After I've, made a little tea, herbal tea or take a pill or something. If it doesn't go away, I go to a doctor, because I would still believe in professional expertise. And I think that this is as true in terms of critics who work in the realm of lifestyle as it is people who do work that's really, 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 truly important and valuable, like surgeons and engineers and airplane pilots and people like that.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm coming to Paris. I want you to tell me a breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a budget, and a breakfast, lunch, and dinner on an extravagant budget.
Oh, okay. Are there any food restrictions?
None.
Okay. I'm happy to answer your question. Before I do, though, there's another thing I'd mention, though, and that is that when people, if you are planning to come to France anytime soon, there is the American food scene and American restaurant owners are very accustomed to responding to food restrictions of one kind or another. It's become a built-in in the American dining experience. It's in France, because the restaurants are tiny and they don't have huge walk-in fridges, they have under-counter fridges. If you have a dietary restriction, let them know before you show up, because don't spring it on them when you are seated at the table. They would love to, cook you something that is, no salt, vegan, celiac, whatever it might be, but prepare them in advance, because there's not the range of reactivity possible in France that there is in the United States. But what I would do with you, I think what I would do for breakfast, let's start with the cheap stuff. There's a wonderful restaurant, because, say you've landed and you're using the air, the suburban train that goes from the airport into the city because you don't have any money. You're jet lagged, you're watching your bags to make sure they don't get stolen if you're not off. You get dumped out on the pavement at the Gare du Nord, which is where it ends. And what I'm going to say is you walk 5 blocks to a place called Holy Belly, which is run by some Australians, because what you need is not a croissant. You need a proper cooked breakfast with really good coffee, a frittata. And this place is really, when I want a real breakfast, because, with all due respect to the French, breakfast is not a meal in France. It is a croissant, a cup of coffee, and still probably about 40% of the time, a cigarette. I was interviewing the owner of a famous French cookware company the other day, and she said to me, I asked her about breakfast, and she said, Alec, I don't know what to do. And I said, why? And she said, can I lie? And I said, don't lie. And she said, my breakfast is, I don't even need a croissant. I just have a cup of coffee and a cigarette. And I know it's horrible, and I know that I should be, and don't tell anyone. Okay. Anyway, this is still France. So we'd have breakfast at Holly Belly. Then what we do is we go out. The best time to go out for a really big meal is at lunchtime. That's when it's cheaper. If we're going to stick to budget, you can go out and do a lunch menu at a really good restaurant, like for example, Guy Savoy, or Guy Savoy, we might pronounce it in English, Guy Savoy, who is in a beautiful, beautiful restaurant overlooking the Seine on the left bank. And there's a special lunch menu that's available only if you sign up for it in advance on the website. And it's about 100 euros, which right now is about $112, which is not cheap. But this is your head-splitting gastronomic experience in a stunningly beautiful place that you're sitting in the airplane with your knees under your chin, hoping to get to a place like this. So this is your big bang treat. And then for dinner, what I would do is we would do a couple of different things. We'd eat oysters, because the French, I hope you like oysters.
Love oysters.
France has the best oysters in the whole world. And you can go to, there are places all over town where you can put your head in the door and have 6 oysters and a glass of wine for about $10. This would be our hors d'oeuvre. Then we go to the Marais district, which is on the right bank. I would take you to sit at, to show you some of our good, really, really first-rate new ethnic food. I don't like the word ethnic, actually. I'd say international food. We have fantastic Israeli chefs in Paris now. We have, we've always had really great Asian cooking. But then I'd take you up to Belleville and we go to an African restaurant, because the latest and newest and most inventive thing that's happening right now in Paris is African cooking. I know this is happening in New York a little bit too, because there's Little Dakar in Harlem and a couple of other African neighborhoods in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. But this is burst on the scene in Paris. So this is what we do on our budget. For the blowout, first we'd have a bottle of champagne. The alarm clock will go off and we will open an incredible bottle of champagne. The best single real luxury, hit it out of the park breakfast in Paris, is the Hotel Bristol, which has a buffet that, any king and queen would be knocked out by this thing. There's caviar and there's Spanish ham and there's eggs cooked to order, and there is champagne. There's somebody who stands at the buffet to pour you champagne as you go through. That's the no holds barred thing. Then I think at lunchtime you might want a view over the city, because Paris is so beautiful. So we would, seen from above, so we'd have lunch at the the Tour d'Argent, which was a stuffy old restaurant on the left bank in the Latin Quarter. And now it's become kind of fun. The previous owner's son, who is half French and half Finnish, because the old French geezer had an affair with a Finnish model. The son has taken over the restaurant. He's turned it into a really good place and hired a brilliant chef. So it's a really fun place to work. And you see the back of Notre Dame, you see everything. And then that night for dinner, I hope, do you like fish?
I do.
Good. I could be, I mean, the Spanish would argue with me, the Japanese would argue with me, but I'd say Paris has the best seafood in Europe because it's supplied by its Atlantic coast and its Mediterranean coast. When I buy, for example, and it's expensive as hell, but if I want to buy a really nice fish like a sea bass, there are sea bass that have been caught by fishermen using fishing poles, and they have little tags, through the gill that tell you where it was caught, what time it was caught, what part of France it was caught in, when it was left, when it actually left the port to be sent to Paris. This is on a serial number that you can look up on your computer. This is how obsessive the French are about seafood.
Wow.
And I think for the seafood blowout, I would probably take you to the Dome in Montparnasse, because it's a famous old cafe on a grand boulevard with fabulous people watching. We'd sit out on the terrace, we'd stuff ourselves, a nice Saule-Meunier, and a good bottle of Merceau, or one of the great French white Burgundies, and just let the world walk by. Gosh, you made me really hungry.
Well, speaking of that, what was the last restaurant you went to that really astonished you, and why?
There's a young chef in Paris right now called Matias Marc, M-A-R-C, and he's from the Jura region in eastern France, which nuzzles up against Switzerland. It's a mountainous forested region of France. And he came to Paris. He came to Paris to go to cooking school. He opened a brilliant restaurant about three or 4 years ago. And now it's just opened a second restaurant, which is called Liquide, or Liquid. And it's right in the heart of the city. It's within walking distance of the Louvre. So it's a fantastic place to know about for visitors, because you can go there for lunch. I'm still happier eating outside than sitting inside in restaurants. Everybody decides for themselves how they feel about this. When I have a choice, I'd rather be in a sidewalk table, both because right now, because the weather's so lovely, Paris is all about people watching, and Liquide is on a small side street, so there's not a lot of traffic, and it's a great place for lunch. His food, Matias Marc's food, is amazing. I mean, it's that thing of being incredibly simple, you think, like a tartare of trout with freshly grated horseradish and chopped beets. Now, you would hear that and say, well, so what? And I'd say, well, so what? But I would never have thought of making that. And it was healthy, light, fresh, delicious, and absolutely fascinating. And also kind of intense to see when this play of like bright, bright purple food in front of me. The food is excellent, and it's also incredibly affordable. So I'll say again, the restaurant is called Liquide. That's liquid with an E on the end of it. It's right in the heart of the city. It's open all summer. We're getting to a place right now in Paris, restaurants are closing for holiday because the French are lucky enough to have a whole month off every summer. But the Liquide will be open all summer. If you're coming to Paris, I think you'll really enjoy it there.
I'm going to totally switch gears and ask you if you have any food memories, what your food memories of growing up in Westport were.
I mentioned in my book, and I'm really happy for this question, Claudia, because I had a bipolar food upbringing. My mother was from Boston, and my father's family from New Orleans. And you guess which side of the family gave me the gastronomic curiosity. With all due respect to Boston today, which has become a great food city, food was not something that we talked about. I mean, my mother was actually a pretty good cook for somebody who had 4 kids, and was a busy lady doing lots of stuff. But it was not a subject of conversation. It was a fleeting pleasure. The most important thing was that it gave you good health. So it was only when I would go down south and where people were obsessed, I mean, truly obsessed by food, that I realized the possibilities. On a more daily basis in Westport, some of the best stuff I ever ate was cooked by the ladies in the cafeteria of the Greens Farms Elementary School on the Post Road,
Really?
which is right over the border from Fairfield, actually. That elementary school has since closed. It was a big brick Tudor building on a hill at the corner of West Parish Road and the Post Road. And in their vanilla tiled kitchen, they cooked from scratch, and they were Italian American, Polish American, from a variety of different backgrounds, and they cooked kielbasa, they cooked manicotti, they cooked, I mean, the food was unbelievably delicious. And when I ran into one of them once in a Caldors, which I don't think they exist anymore, I recognized her and I said to her, blurted out, I said, I just wanted to thank you so much for the meatball grinders that you used to make, because they were, when I saw them, when they still published school menus in the Westport News, which is the only thing I read in the newspaper. I looked forward to those from one grinder to the next. They were just unbelievably delicious with that marinara sauce and everything else. And your food was astonishing. And I've never forgotten it. And I know how hard it would be to feed that many kids cooking with government surplus food or whatever it was. And she got very fluttered and she said, well, it was a holy honor to cook for you kids, which is one of the most moving things I've ever heard anyone say about cooking or food to this day. But we, so the cafeteria food was excellent, but as we all know, Southwestern Connecticut is one of the world's great pizza belts. I have wonderful pizza memories. We also had a fantastic Chinese restaurant in downtown Westport called Westlake, which even years later, it's not there anymore, alas. I only now realize just how good it actually was. There was a lot of variety in Southwestern Connecticut. I mean, of course, there were the colonial restaurants, these sort of ye old type things like the Red Barn and the Allen's Clam House and all these places. Most of which are pretty much given up the ghost, where you'd have things like Indian pudding and chicken pot pie and stuff like that, and popovers. So, compared to friends, I realized when I went to college and, my friends were from all over the United States, I realized that coming from the Northeast, I'd actually had an incredibly varied and rich diet. Not because we were fancy eaters, but because I grew up in Southwestern Connecticut. I mean, having been there recently, the food is still excellent in Southwestern Connecticut, and there's more choice and variety now than there ever was before, but one eats really, really well there. So where I'm from was a great diving board for me to go out into the world of, dive into the world of gastronomy elsewhere, and most of all France.
When you visited recently up here, did you go to any place that?
Sorry?
When you visited up here recently, did you go out to eat?
I went out to we were in New York City for a couple of days, and the meal that I most enjoyed during the northern end of this trip was at Gage and Co, which is an old restaurant in downtown Brooklyn that has just reopened. And for me, it's a quintessential American story. Gage and Co, which is beautiful. They've restored it beautifully with the old brass gas lamps overhead. And the chef is a young Korean American woman, and she's very respectful of the traditional foods. I mean, it's really very old-fashioned American food, except that she tweaks it here and there. For example, instead of Clams Casino, she makes something called Clams Casino, which she seasons with kimchi, the fermented cabbage. Mm-hmm. Which might sound strange, but it was unbelievably delicious. I'm just sorry there are only 6 of them, because I could have eaten 36 of them. And at that price, just hold on to your hat. They're not giving anything away there. But the baked goods, the American baked goods, like, coconut cake, a great big steak with all the food is absolutely delicious. I absolutely adored that meal.
What's it called again?
Gage and Tollner. Gage is Gage. Okay. And Tollner is Tollner, and it's in downtown Brooklyn, which is perfectly safe and very easy to get to. So, coming in from Connecticut, there's an express train directly to downtown Brooklyn, and it's a special occasion restaurant, and it was fun. It was really fun. The people who work, the service was fantastic. It was everything that I love about eating in the United States, because the great churn of America. I think that, American food reflects a lot of what I consider to be the most wonderful things about the United States. I mean, when I go to the US, I often take, European friends who come with me to Ellis Island in the harbor in New York, because for me, the immigration experience is what made America. And it's also what has given us this piano key palate, which is so American, because we know as Americans we've had Chinese food, we've had Korean food, we've had sushi, we've had Latin food, we've had all kinds of stuff. You go to Europe and people get frightened if you go out of your lane a teeny bit when you're making spaghetti and meatballs. It's still very conservative a lot of the time in Europe compared to the US.
That's great. Do you have a favorite food city in France aside from Paris?
My favorite food destination right now in France, aside from Paris, is Marseille, which is kind of New York City on the Mediterranean. I mean, it's a big, heaving port town. A lot of Americans, when they come to France, give it a miss because they saw what was that movie about the drug trade there? Anyway.
Beacon?
Yeah, exactly. That's long gone. I mean, Marseille has become I should say Marseille is like Brooklyn on the Mediterranean. It's all these hipsters from all over France. It's the most popular city for young French people to live in. They don't want to live in Paris anymore. They want to live someplace where it's sunny, the rents are lower. And it's a little funky. It's like a Gaelic version of Barcelona. The setting of Marseille is magnificent. And the diversity of the population of about 1.5 million down there. There are 200,000 Algerians, there are 120,000 people from the Comore Islands, which are off the east coast of Africa. It's a big bubbling pot of peoples, and they don't live in, everybody eats and cooks each other's food. And in a younger generation where they really do eat each other's food, there's a lot of cross-hatching and cross-fertilization. So you have an ingredient which is traditionally North African, like pickled lemons, is used all over the place in Marseille by young French chefs in fancy restaurants. Pickled lemons are like lemons on acid. They are a secret ingredient bar none. They do sell them at Stop and Shop. If you've never used them before, play with them. They're fantastic. But Marseille, between the seafood, the international offer, incredible pizza. Half the city is of Italian origin. Marseille, along with Chicago, Chicago and Marseille were the two fastest growing cities in the world during the 19th century. Marseille boomed because of the Suez Canal opening. There's everything in that city, including really good bistro food. There's fancy food, and I think the best seafood in France. And if there are two restaurants, fancy restaurants not to miss, there is Le Petit Nice, which is a seafood restaurant in a beautiful setting, and a new 3-star restaurant, which is worth every penny. Again, go at lunchtime because it's much cheaper. And it's called AM, and those are the initials of the chef, Alexander Macia, who's a French guy who grew up, believe it or not, in the Congo because his father was a merchant of rare wood. So his early taste memories were African. Then the family went back to France. But his food it's some of the most fascinating food I've eaten in years. So Marseille, my answer to your question is,
excellent.
I can go to Marseille. I could go to Marseille for a week and do nothing but eat.
Oh, it sounds really good. I just want to mention to everybody, if you have a question, type it in or unmute yourself and ask Alec, and we'll continue to talk. But if you have questions, that's what he's here for. So please go ahead and ask. So I'm going to ask you, do you still think France is the best gastronomic destination in the Western world?
Is there anybody French listening to this? Of course I do. And I'll tell you why. I'm not yes, now having lived in France for over 30 years, I have two countries. I have America, which I love dearly, and I have France, which I love dearly. I'm a really blessed person. Two wonderful countries in my life. The reason French food is still so extraordinary is that France has unbelievable produce. I mean, the basic raw ingredients are second to none. As I explained to you when I was talking about the fish that comes, to the fish market with that tag in its gill that allows you to look up and see when it was caught by whom, where, what zone in the sea, how long it took to get from. I mean, the detail and the passion and the logistical intelligence applied to creating and delivering the really the best ingredients in Europe, I think, makes the square one, which is you buy your raw food and you go into the kitchen with it, the perfect point of departure. Then you have a gastronomic education. The French cooking schools are like military academies. I have worked, I've been in many of them. They're terrifying places. There is a right and a wrong way to do everything. You know, I have people have chased me with knives. I have failed cooking classes over and over and over again because I have not known how to carve a radish. You could say all of this stuff is nonsense. And yet on the other hand, what I have learned is how to make a stock or a bouillon, which is what the basis of all the sauces are. I've learned how to cook meat. I've learned how to do this. I've learned how to do dozens of things because of the ferocity and the exigence of that type of education, which is the best in the world. And that's why so many foreign people come to France for cooking education. After that, the literacy, the gastronomic literacy of the French public is still, I think, the only other country that even approaches that is Japan. I mean, the Japanese, have a cult of produce, like the French have a cult of produce. When I was in Tokyo once, and we converted the 575,000 yen on a little, calculator in a department store, and we're looking at each other and thinking, one melon could not cost $575,000. And the saleswoman came over and said, it does. That melon does cost $575, and they're worth it. They are the best melons in the whole world. I will tell you now, I don't know whether that's true or not, because I did not have $575 to spend on a melon. But France is, in French schoolrooms, there are maps of the country on the wall with pictograms of food. And the children learn that this is where the best cherries come from. This is where the cheeses come from. Although the cheeses come from everywhere in France. There's this depth of knowledge and proud knowledge and communal knowledge that means that when they go and sit down for a meal, they bring high expectations and a really deep knowledge of what it is that's going to be, that's going to be served to them. So it also makes them, for anybody who's really ambitious, fantastic people to cook for, because if you can please these people, it means that you're really good. So from my point of view, in terms of the Western world, yes, France is still number one. That being said, France has done such a good job at provoking our gastronomic curiosity in England, Canada, Australia, the US, and other countries, that the distance between France and America, and where any other, Scandinavia, everywhere, now has shrunken. I mean, there's great food all over the world now. It's not that sort of, France is not the gastronomic Oz that it was in the past. It's still the benchmark for excellence.
What do you personally like to cook?
What do I like to cook?
Yeah.
My favorite things to do, I love, in Paris, I go to the market on Saturday morning, the market, which is an open air market on the afternoon, President Wilson in the 16th. And if I'm in the south, we're near the city of Nîmes, excuse me, which has one of the best covered markets in France. I don't decide what I'm going to cook until I've done a tour of the market to see what's in season, what looks best. The food that kind of cries out to you. In Nîmes, for example, we have the best fishmonger in France, which is a huge luxury. I mean, the actual woman who runs the stand is from Brittany, which is, seafood central. But she's also a master of Mediterranean seafood. So she'll send me a text saying, I'm going to have those white shrimp that you like so much in the Mediterranean. Should I put some under the counter? Are you going to come in, or I'll put them under the counter for you? I mean, there's this wonderful complicity because, there's this pride in wanting to share, share good food, share the experience of good food, talking about good food. But my cooking especially, my cooking is very umami bomb style cooking. I like really ruddy, hearty, Things like the bourguignon. I like blanquette de veau, which is a veal stew with onions and mushrooms and cream sauce, a little bit of lemon juice. I love seafood. I also am very not French in terms of loving Mexican food, spicy things. When my French friends come for dinner, everybody always says to me rather, warily, "So, what have you cooked tonight, Alec?" And I always think, I hope you have not gotten too crazy with the spices. I like to get crazy with spices. There's not a kitchen that I don't like. I've been lucky enough to have traveled hugely. I've eaten fantastic food everywhere that I've been, Albania and Slovenia, and those two countries, by the way, being the dark horse gastronomic countries in Europe right now. I mean, nobody knows their food, Slovenia and Albania, but the food is spectacular. But I am very much do I follow recipes? I'm inspired by recipes, but sometimes I'll take shortcuts. I think a recipe I'm more like Elizabeth, the British food writer, Elizabeth David, whose recipes were sort of approximate. And I'm not worried that things are not going to turn out. If you're baking, you have to be very careful because that's science. But cooking is, I think, very personal, and the cook's personality shows up in what they're making. And I cook French. I often cook Louisiana dishes during the winter, like jambalaya or shrimp creole or things like that, because the French love the storytelling of the dish. When I explain to them that this is the food that originated in New Orleans, which was your colony, but was also, it's a reflection of African, Native American, Spanish, Caribbean. The food of New Orleans has all these different inputs. So I'm a real omnivore, actually.
I loved the part in the book, and maybe just share a little bit about your landlady, the Contessa, and how
Oh gosh, yes. Well, when I first moved to Paris, the company was paid for me to stay in a hotel until I could find an apartment, which was great. But I did eventually have to find an apartment, and finally, which is not easy to do, especially since my French was terrible. With all due respect to my French teacher at Long Lots Junior High School in Westport, Connecticut, I was not really the world's best French speaker when I showed up in Paris. So an English correspondent for Reuters, the British news service, was transferred from Paris to Hong Kong, and I took over his apartment, which was not in a neighborhood that I would ever have chosen probably to live in. It was a very fancy sort of like, say, Park Avenue at 66th Street. It was a very fancy part of Paris, which I didn't even understand in those days. I just was an apartment that was available, so this was an easy solution to a complicated problem. A very formal building, and my landlord was a French countess and her British husband, who had worked at the British Embassy in Paris. And one Saturday morning, there's a knock on the door, and the concierge was there with a note on a little silver tray, which sort of blew me away. I thought, I hope that's not a parking ticket or a warrant for my arrest. But no, it was an invitation to come to Sunday lunch in a week's time from my landlord and landlady and her husband. And my stomach sort of sank, and I thought, oh dear, I can't say no because they'll know that they lived over me. I lived on the ground floor. So I went, and it was extremely formal, and the conversation was somewhat labored. They had a very difficult relationship, and they were both like cat and dog. They were like two cats playing with a ball of yarn. I was the ball of yarn. And she was trying to get me to say that the food in England, where I've lived twice, was disgusting. And he was trying to get me to admit that I missed the food in England because the French food was actually just inedible. But we sat down at the table. We were served at the table by the Spanish concierge who also worked for them. And we discovered that we had this great passion for food. And So then she suddenly stopped being a countess. She became very excited and told me about her childhood in Morocco, because Morocco was a French colony and her father was the general in the French army, and that she grew up eating Moroccan food and how this had given her a different palate. And it was fascinating. And then she asked me a lot of questions about what I ate in the United States, including, I told her about how moving to France meant learning to eat all over again. And she said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, for me, when I went to buy potatoes the other day, the man in the shop said to me, well, what are you going to do with them? And I said, well, cook them. And he said, yeah, well, yeah, you're going to cook them, but I mean, what are you going to cook them with? And then he showed me, he had over a dozen different types of potatoes. And I said, well, I don't know, because I knew what? I knew Idaho potatoes, you bake them, Maine potatoes, you mash them, and the little red ones you make into potato salad. That was all I knew. So it was true. I was learning a whole new thing, but I was learning French food, and she became my tutor. And she told me, when I sort of shyly suggested that one day it would be fun to write about food and to review restaurants, and she said, she gave me, sometimes this happens in life, she gave me this mantra. It became my mantra. And she said, the most important thing is, first of all, you have to stay humble. You have to really know what you're talking about, and you really have to respect the hard work that has gone into this cooking. But then your job is to decipher what were the intentions of the chef. Why was, what did the person who cooked this food want to accomplish? What message did that person want to send, across the plate? And I said, well, what message could that be? And she said, well, it could be to send love. It could be to show off. It could be a special occasion. It could be, there are lots of messages that are delivered by cooking, Alexander. And if you're going to become a food writer or a restaurant, you're going to have to learn this language. And she was right.
That's fantastic. I'm curious, are you working on a new book right now, or what are you thinking about with your writing?
I am working on a new book. The new book, and I think if my agent is listening, she'll be happy to hear that I just said yes. I'm working on the proposal for the next book. COVID completely knocked my life off the rails. And I spent most of the year living in the little village in the south of France. And what I learned actually is that it would be like moving from New York to Kentucky. I left Paris. I've lived my whole life in huge cities, aside from Westport. And suddenly living in a village of 1,200 people, deep in the French countryside, in a very agricultural part of France, was a completely different experience. And their perception of me, first of all, as a foreigner, an American, and they still don't know what to do with me in the village, because they say, he speaks beautiful French. And now when I go to the post office in the morning, the postmistress looks up behind her little guichet and she goes, ah, bonjour, notre américain. Good morning, our American, which I find so charming, because it denotes difference, but it also is inclusive. I mean, the pronoun is our. In other words, now I am part of the village. And I have overheard people in gardens saying, there's an American writer who lives in the village. So the second volume of my life story or ruminations about life in France, I would say that the basic theme is, I'll always have Paris, but now I've discovered France. I mean, I've traveled in France for years, but having spent more time outside of the city, I realized what the difference is between Paris and France. And there's so much to learn. And I've become friends with people. It's much more relaxed in the South than it is in Paris. It's a much more intimate daily life. I've become great friends with my cheesemonger, who recently asked me to work in the market with him in Nîmes behind the counter when his assistant went away for a week. And I can't tell you how surprised people were when they came to buy the cheese. And the cheesemonger said, this is Alec. He's my temporary assistant. And I'd say, what can I serve you and everything else? And people would go, you have a little accent. Are you Swiss? And I said, oh, not Swiss. are you Belgian? No, 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 no. I said, no, I'm American. And they go, I'm buying cheese, French cheese from an American. This is like the horror, the Twilight Zone.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Um, and so basically my pleasure is in continuing to, I mean, I'm a hugely curious person about everything really, but food, France, travel, human relationships. So I feel that in a way, quite accidentally, I was gifted a whole, I call it my new French life. It's a completely new, fresh take on France. And that will be, part of that'll be the lead theme of what I go on to do. And eventually I'd also maybe like to write some fiction, but, one thing at a time.
Great. Well, I hope you'll come back to talk about the book once it's out in the world.
I love
I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned so many restaurants, like when we went through, like if I did a day in Paris, are those restaurants included in your 30 best on the back of the book?
You know what I will do? I will go back and I will send you an email with all these restaurants so that if anybody has listened to us tonight, because you won't understand I mean, we moved briskly because we only had a certain amount of time here. I'll write all that stuff down, send it to you, and so anybody who
send it out
wants
to all of
reads
you.
those things, you they can email you and say, I would like to have these things from Alec. And a couple of them actually are in the 30 in the little black book. But breakfast is, I'm more French about breakfast most of the time than I am anything else.
Well, before we say goodbye to Alec, is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Unmute, type it in, or we can say goodnight. I know Anne is going to preview what's coming up for the fall of What's Cooking. There she is. Go ahead, Anne, and then if somebody comes up with a question. You're muted, Anne.
Hi, I've been so delighted to listen to you. I've been in France myself several times. I used to go with my significant other, and the last time I was in Paris was in 2009. But you just sparked all the love that I have. My question to you is the markets. If I've been there in September, and the markets were flourishing, but how are they during the winter season? Where do they get their produce, which they do so well? And would you also agree that the food from there is the taste is so great because of the soil or something in the air, the Mediterranean, the land? I was wondering what you thought about that.
The wonderful thing is, I mean, you might think, I would tell you, first of all, that one of the nicest time of the year to come to France is winter, because our winters are very mild. And French cooking per se, a lot of the great dishes of the French kitchen taste best on kind of a raw, wet day. All of those deeply simmered things like the poignant and coq au vin, all of that stuff tastes so good when you stepped in out of the rain. But the markets are fantastic all the year long because, for example, there's a constant segue of produce. I look forward to, every time I go, I look forward to going to the market, but every time there's something new, suddenly it's the first asparagus. Then for example, the market I go to in Paris has a stand which is famous for its mushrooms, and the mushrooms change all year long. They come from different parts of France. And some of the best mushroom, I mean, in terms of like we call them porcini most of the time in the US, but in the French, they call them cèpes. Truffles, ceps, there are all kinds of things that it's high mushroom season for mushroom lovers during the winter. And there's still parts of the country where, I mean, they grow watercress, they grow mâche, which I think we call lamb's lettuce. It's not the shutdown that you might expect. Winter doesn't cause the French farming to close down. The offer is not as abundant in certain terms, but there's fresh French grown salads of one kind or another all year long. So no, the markets they don't lose their allure during the winter at all. And winter's a terrific time to visit Paris and France generally, because there are no crowds, and so many of those traditional French dishes, as I said, just taste so good on a kind of a cool or cold day.
Thanks for the question. And do you want to preview what's coming up for the fall?
Sure. So, Alec, you have actually set this up just so perfectly. Your reference to walking through the market and looking at what is fresh and what sort of sparks your curiosity. That is actually how we will start our What's Cooking series in the fall. The date is Monday, September 20th. It will be at 6:30 p.m. And we are honored to have Michelle Michon, who will be helping all of us prepare a special box of local produce that will be provided to us by a company by the name of Berkshire Direct. This will be, all of the details will be on our website. Again, the date is September 20th for the launch of the Fall What's Cooking series. So we look forward to seeing you and cooking fresh produce.
Thank you, Anne. Alec, I cannot thank you enough. It was like an armchair visit to Paris, which was, and really around France. It was delightful. Thank you for your knowledge.
It was truly my pleasure. And as I said, it was a particular pleasure to revisit the part of the world that I'm originally from.
That's great. Great. Well, keep us in mind for your next book. And
absolutely.
And I'll look forward to your email, and I will forward that email on to all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Claudia. Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody, for attending. Good night.
Thank you for taking us around the world.
Agreed.